forward to it for a long time, and I'm thankful for the topic that we have to consider tonight. I'm thankful for Brother Mike's leadership in this. He mentioned the TV show A Bible Answer. I moved to Jackson a couple of years ago, and I'd heard of A Bible Answer, but I had never watched it before. And then I got a chance to be on the show, and I didn't know how many people in the congregation where I preach watched A Bible Answer. We never had really talked about it. But then after I was on that Sunday, everybody came to me. It seemed like just about everybody was saying, "Oh, we saw you on A Bible Answer. We saw you on A Bible Answer." And that says to me that that show is reaching out there, even into the surrounding areas and beyond. A lot of people watch that show. And that's important. Not because I get to be on it, but because the truth is taught. And we're thankful that people get to ask their questions, and even some very challenging questions. And those are always met with a considered, thoughtful response. And we're thankful for Mike's leadership and your support of that program. I think it's doing a great work. Science is a big problem for many people of faith. I want to be able to show you some information about that if I can get my clicker to cooperate. Am I doing something incorrect?
Go take a look at the screen.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to...
Okay.
I wonder if my clicker is on. It'd be good to start on the right foot, and then we'll be good to go after that.
We may have to hit that button.
That's okay. I can do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's see if it'll do it. Yeah, it did. Okay. So do that. Okay. Now I think.
Okay, good to go. Thank you. All right. So as you see on the screen, there is a Barna study in 2011. It did not survey merely members of the Lord's Church, but it was people who claim to be Christians. So we're using Christian in the broad sense of the word to include folks in denominations and Catholics, but people who espouse Christ. And this was a 5-year study. It involved many people, very scholarly study. And in this study, it was found that 3 out of 10 young adults with a Christian background, 29%, feel that churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. Another 1/4 embrace the perception that Christianity is anti-science. And nearly the same, let's see, did I go backwards? Okay, I'm sorry. I really want to be able to, there we go. Okay, 23% said that they had been turned off by the creation versus evolution debate. And furthermore, the research showed that many science-minded young Christians are struggling to find ways of staying faithful to their beliefs and to their profession while in science-related industries. Okay, so one way or another, science is a problem for people who believe in God and the Bible. It's caused many people to question their faith and to leave their faith. Well, what is science? An old definition of science, which comes from the Latin word scientia, just means knowledge. So that's kind of the old-fashioned broad definition. Anything you would claim to know would be something about which you have science. You have knowledge about it. But that's not really the way the word is typically used in our contemporary society. Notice the definition from Richard P. Feynman, the Nobel laureate, in his book, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. He's a theoretical physicist, and here's how he defines science. He says, as a matter of fact, science can be defined as a method for and a body of information obtained by trying to answer only questions which can be put into the form, if I do this, what will happen? The technique of it fundamentally is try it and see. So he says science answers questions, if I do this, what will happen? So it's an experimental enterprise. He continues, then you put together a large amount of information from such experiences. All scientists will agree that a question, any question, philosophical or other, which cannot be put into the form that can be tested by experiment is not a scientific question. It is outside the realm of science. Well, that's a fine definition of science. So this would indicate that in our contemporary society, science refers to the hard sciences, like geology and biology and chemistry and physics, and doesn't include what's sometimes called soft sciences like sociology. It certainly doesn't include religion. It certainly doesn't include philosophy. So science would be associated with experimental sciences. That's how he's using the word. And for our purposes, I'm happy to use that definition of science tonight. But then there is another definition we need to give, where some people have said that science, like the hard sciences, as we've just used the word, that science is the only way to know anything. And this is a view we could call scientism. Notice, scientism is the view that science alone can give us knowledge. So if I were to say, for example, Jesus died for my sins, and that has something to do with whether I can go to heaven or not, that would be a topic about which I could not have knowledge if scientism is true. I could have a feeling about it, or I could have an opinion about it, or I could have supposition or desire, but I couldn't have knowledge. You couldn't be said to know that. Or what if I said the Bible is from God? I could believe that, or I could suppose it, but if scientism is true, then I could never know that the Bible is from God. Or what if I said something like, we should eat the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? I could hope that we would eat the Lord's Supper. I could believe that that would be important, but I could never know that God actually expects us to eat the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, because I can't test that in a laboratory. I can't observe with my five senses that God exists, or that Jesus who died on the cross is his son. I can't see heaven. None of these claims that I've made about religion are testable in a laboratory. I can't observe them with my five senses. And so if scientism is true, I cannot have knowledge about any of those things. A lot of people are persuaded by scientism. Just to give you a flavor of how people talk who believe in scientism, let me give you some quotations. First of all, from Harry Kyoto, who's a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. He said, science is the only philosophical construct we have to determine truth with, notice it, with any degree of reliability. So if you say something about God, if you say something about heaven or hell, if you say something about Jesus being a divinely sent Son of God, well, then that would be something you may have a feeling about, but you have no degree of certainty that that is true, that anything you're saying about it is true. Notice Peter Atkins, who is a now retired chemist of Oxford University, and by the way, he wrote a lot of chemistry textbooks that are very good as far as I know, and very smart person, but he's an atheist and believed in scientism. In fact, he's maybe the most hard-boiled scientism believer I've ever seen. But he said, science is so powerful that it shows that all of the ancient traditional ideas derived from religion are OTOs. They're out of date, unnecessary. Science, he says, is a wonderful way of explaining the world, and I think we humans should be delighted that we have brains sufficient to unravel the secrets of the universe and discover the fabric of reality. So how do we know reality? Just through science and through nothing else. So through experiment with our five senses, we get access to reality, but there's no other source of knowledge. Well, that would mean any claims about God and the Bible, heaven or hell, anything like that is OTOs, unnecessary, unreliable. It's fine if you want to believe it, but you can never be said to know it. Just to illustrate this, think about your dentist for a minute. You allow your dentist to put his hand in your mouth and operate on your teeth because he has knowledge about molars, about gums, about incisors. He's allowed to operate in public as a dentist. And he's treated with the respect that's accorded somebody who has a body of knowledge, because you can know things about teeth. And you can know things about the human body, about the anatomy of the mouth and the gums and so forth. You can know that. And for example, if there's a TV program about medicine, maybe there's a news program about some developments in the medical community, and they have a guest on the talk show, and it'll be like a medical doctor or a nurse or someone, and they'll ask for their knowledge. What do you know about this subject under consideration, and the doctor will speak, and they'll say, well, we're thankful to have this doctor who is board certified and who teaches at this university or who practices medicine at this clinic or whatever the case may be. They're allowed to operate in public because they have knowledge about it, and what they're being asked for is for their knowledge. But then when we come over to areas of religion and morality, if they have a preacher on, or if they have an ethical philosopher on to a show like that, they're going to be asked for not knowledge, but for what they believe, or what their opinion is, or maybe about what the opinion of their church is, but not for knowledge, because the general view of society today seems to be that science gives you knowledge and everything else gives you opinion or belief, but you can't be said to know it. Another statement along those lines is from Jerry Coyne, who's a biologist from the University of Chicago, and he's published widely in support of Darwinian evolution. He says, truth is simply what is, what exists in reality, and notice can be verified by rational and independent observers. It is true that DNA is a double helix, that the continents move, and that the earth revolves around the sun. Notice he continues, it is not true, at least in the dictionary sense, that somebody had a revelation from God. The scientific claims can be corroborated by anyone with the right tools, while a revelation, though perhaps reflecting someone's real perception, says nothing about reality. For unless that revelation has empirical content, it cannot be verified. That seems to be an obvious endorsement of scientism. See? Well, this has caused a lot of doubt. Remember, our topic is that we want to restore our faith when science has caused us to doubt. Well, has science caused people to doubt? At least, has scientism caused people to doubt? I would suggest yes. Let me give you some examples. According to the Pew Research Center in 2021, about 30% of U.S. adults are now religiously unaffiliated. That means they're called nuns. If you were to survey them and ask for their religious affiliation, they wouldn't mark any church or any religion. They would mark none. So they're called nuns, which is up about 12% from just a decade ago. And according to Gallup, in the same year, church membership is declining every generation. 60% of traditionalists belong to a church. That would be my grandparents' generation. 58% of baby boomers, 50% of those in Generation X, and then 36% of millennials and Generation Z, to the degree that we have access to information about this up-and-coming generation. So notice that the religious affiliation is dropping significantly every generation. Does that have something to do with the belief that science has made religion OTOs, or unnecessary, or out of date? I suggest that it does. Now, there are two things that are often called doubt. And one is okay, one is not okay. Let's distinguish between the two. On the one hand, the Bible endorses legitimate questioning of our beliefs to determine the rational basis for those beliefs. For example, 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, test all things and hold fast to that which is good. Well, that implies a certain measure of doubt, where I ask myself, how do I know that belief X is true? I may say to myself, this is a very helpful thing to do, how do I know that Jesus was raised from the dead? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Is there good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? It's a very faith-building exercise to go through the historical data that shows that Jesus was raised from the dead. I wish I had time to do that tonight. Or have you ever asked yourself, how do I know that God exists in the first place? And then you can very well find the evidence. Again, we won't go through very much of that tonight, but you can find the answer. And so we've already heard a prayer tonight where someone prayed, our brother prayed from Acts 17, verse 11, that we would be like the noble Bereans who doubted in a spiritual sense, in a biblical sense. They said, wait a minute, we're hearing a message. How do we know that it is true? We'll check and make sure that it's in keeping with God's Word. Remember, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of Christ, Romans 10:17. And so faith is not believing that for which we have no evidence, but it's believing based on rational testimony, even though we haven't seen the objects that are involved in our belief. For example, we believe in heaven, not because we've seen heaven, but because we have reliable testimony from people who are in a position to know about that. For example, the Apostle Paul, who has been to heaven, who had a vision of it in 2 Corinthians 12, and from Jesus Christ himself, who told about heaven and how he was going to prepare a place for us there in John 14, and so on. So we have reliable testimony. In the same way that I believe that England exists, even though I've never been to England personally. My sister has. She got to travel over there with the Freed Hardman group while she was in college, and she saw all kinds of places in Europe that I've never been able to see. I'm not bitter about it. It's not as though I think about it very often. I just want you to know, it's not that I have any hard feelings that she's gotten to gallivant all over Europe and I've never been over there at all myself. But leave that be. She tells me it's there because she's seen it. And so even though I haven't seen it, I have reliable testimony. Same way for Jesus' resurrection. I wasn't there to see Jesus raised from the dead. I didn't live 2,000 years ago. But there were plenty of people who did live 2,000 years ago who gave us their testimony about those facts that go back to within just a few years of the Lord's resurrection. And we can talk about that evidence another time. I'm just saying faith, which we're trying to restore by our teaching this week, is not believing that for which we have no evidence. It's believing based on reliable testimony from people who are in a position to know. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says says that we walk by faith and not by sight. So put that together with the verse we quoted a minute ago from Romans 10:17, that faith comes by hearing the word of Christ. And you'll find that we walk according to the word of Christ. Not because we've seen everything that we believe. They hadn't even seen it when Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. People living in Corinth, in Greece, had not been over in Palestine while Jesus lived. So he could tell them, you haven't seen Jesus. You were not walking with him as the apostles were. You haven't had a vision of him as I did on the road to Damascus, Paul would say. But you believe by faith, based on the reliable testimony of the prophecies that the apostles and the apostolic circle were giving in the first century. So that's just by way of background to say, here's the faith that we're restoring. The other kind of doubt, not questioning and saying, how do we know to be true what we believe? The other kind of doubt, which is sinful, is taking a skeptical position. That attitude is, I'm not interested in the evidence. I'm not going to find it. I'm just going to take the attitude, God probably doesn't exist. And if God exists, I doubt there's any way I could know it, and I'm not going to really pursue or be honest with the evidence that's out there. That kind of doubt is a sin. It's condemned in James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, where James says, and he's even talking about professed Christians in the passage, and he says if they pray doubting, then they should not expect that they will receive anything from the Lord. Because the man who doubts is like the waves that are driven and tossed by the sea. Here's an unstable person. And God says, you don't expect to receive any answer to your prayers if you pray with the attitude that I don't even know if my prayer is getting above the ceiling. And I doubt God really hears and will do anything about my prayers. So doubt is wrong, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, taking a skeptical position. Not saying, let me weigh the evidence and see where the evidence leads and be honest with it and pursue answers to my questions. But saying, I can't know and I'm not interested in pursuing whether I can know or not. So those are two kinds of doubt. We're trying to heal the second kind of doubt and provide evidence that would satisfy a person who is exercising the legitimate doubt in the first place. I hope we all understand that. In John 8:32, Jesus said, you shall know the truth. He did not just say, you shall have an opinion about something. He said you can know it. He didn't say you can have a positive emotion about God. He said you can know it. And in John 17:17, Jesus said, sanctify them by thy truth. Thy word is truth. Is it possible to know the truth? Jesus said you've got to know it so well that you can be sanctified by it. That means that it can change your life. That you can be transformed by the renewing of your mind, to use Paul's language in Romans 12:2. In Romans 2:8, we find that people who are lost are going to be those who did not obey the truth. So is it possible to know what the truth is? Well, Paul and Jesus and the other apostles clearly believed not just that we could have a good opinion about it, but that we could know it. So in the next few minutes, here's what I want to do. I'm going to ask the following questions. And I think we can do this in just a very short amount of time. We can say, what is knowledge? Answer that. What is truth? And then we will say, is science the only way to know the truth? And then if we have time, we're going to say, what is the relationship between science and the knowledge of God? We won't be able to exhaust these subjects, but we'll at least get some ideas on the table to help us to restore our faith. So first of all, what is knowledge? Knowledge is justified, true belief. JTB, if that helps you. Just remember the acronym, JTB. That's what knowledge is. That's the classical philosophical definition of knowledge, and it's biblical too, because in 1 John 2:3, for example, we read, hereby we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. In other words, there's a knowledge claim. We have a belief that we have come to know him, and it is true, and we have a warrant for it, or we have a justification for it, which is that we have observed that we keep his commandments. So knowledge is justified, true belief. It's not a lucky guess. For example, I might be correct, but I not have knowledge because I'm just making a lucky guess. Like if I'm playing a trivia game about animals, if we're having a trivia contest in our house about animals, my wife knows way more about animals. So I may get a question about some rare spotted owl or something, and I say, I think the answer is, and I blurt out the answer, and I happen to be right, but it's not because I knew it. It's not because I had warrant. I didn't have any reliable testimony about that, as we said a minute ago. It's just a lucky guess. Well, that's not knowledge. In fact, my wife might look at me and say, Caleb, did you know that? I got the answer right. That's a separate question. Did you know it? And I might say, oh, no, I didn't know it. I just hazarded a lucky guess, which is a lot easier if you have a multiple choice question or if you have a true-false question. A lot of times with multiple choice, the answer is C, many times. So I might just luckily guess C, and I didn't know it. But if I know something, that means I believe it, it's true, and I have some warrant, some properly situated justification for what I believe. So it's justified, true belief. Now the next thing we want to say, I'm sorry I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint here. I'm going to skip over some material here for the sake of time and go on to truth. So we said, what is knowledge? It's justified, true belief. What is truth? Truth is, this is not complicated, correspondence to reality. If I have a true belief, that means there is a match or a connect between my belief and what reality actually is. And if I talk about objective truth, that means a true statement is objective if it's true, independent of whether anybody believes it or not. It's just the way the world is. For example, it is true that there is a church building on Playground Road in Caruthersville, even if nobody knew it existed, and even if people refuse to believe it, it's still there. That's the truth. That's how the world is. It's true that the Nazis were wrong when they committed genocide against the Jews and killed 6 million Jews. That was wrong even if the Nazis had successfully exterminated everybody who disagreed with them or brainwashed everybody who disagreed with them. I'm sure they would have liked to have done that. It still would have been wrong. Even if everybody living agreed with what they did, it still would have been wrong. That means it's objectively true. It's not subjectively generated, where a person gets to make up the truth for himself. It's just how the world is. Let me give you some easy examples of this. Suppose my question is, does General Mills make Cheerios cereal? How would I find out the answer? Would I look inward and ask myself how I feel about it? No, I would look for some relevant source of authority in the world to give me the reason why General Mills does or does not make Cheerios. And I could find out the answer. I would check to see how the world is. It's objective. That's what we mean when we talk about objective truth. Or what if I want to know whether LeBron James plays for the Los Angeles Lakers? How would I find out whether that's true or not? I wouldn't just ask myself what my opinion about LeBron's team affiliation is. That doesn't really matter, does it? I could like it or not like it. I could believe in it or not believe in it. The question is, how is the world? Is it the case that he actually plays for that team or not? And I could check with a relevant source of authority. I could check NBA.com, or I could call up the Lakers office. That's kind of old-fashioned, isn't it? Well, maybe I could send them a fax, for that matter. But I could find out some way or another if LeBron plays for that team. And it would not be a matter of my opinion about it. It would just be seeing how things are in the world. That's an objective truth. So truth is correspondence to reality. We've talked about objective truth. What about that phrase, absolute truth? Sometimes we use that, absolute truth. Well, absolute truth refers to a statement that is true unchangingly. That is, it will never change. For example, it will always be the case, forever, even in heaven, that George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's absolutely true. It's unchangingly true. The statement George Washington was the first president of the United States will never change. So it's absolutely true. We've talked about objective truth and absolute truth. We know what truth is. It's correspondence to reality. We know that knowledge is justified true belief. So it is believing a truth, believing a correspondence to reality that has justification, has a warrant for it. Can religion provide knowledge? See, that's our real question. Can religion give you something that you don't just have a belief about, but a justified true belief? A lot of people say no. One more example. This is not from a scientist or a scholar. This is just some lady writing on the internet. But I thought it was a pretty good example. I found this on a message board somewhere, and I think this pretty well states the contemporary view of the matter. She says religion consists of the stories and laws surrounding the particular God. Those who believe based on faith, not fact. Faith is believing in something with no reason to believe. We've already seen that that's not the Bible definition of faith. Atheists prefer to base their belief on what? Factual information, not fantasy. A more scholarly opinion is from Michael Roos. He says the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. What's he saying? He says, you think you know the truth, that it's important to love your neighbor as yourself, but you can't test that in a laboratory. You could never have justification for that. The idea that we should love our neighbor as ourselves and treat one another in a good way is just an adaptation like your hands and your feet and your teeth. It's something that evolution has given you. It's just a socio-biological spin-off of natural selection. It's just some random fact of nature. It's not anything that has objective truth. So you can't know any truths about morality. Is that the case? Let's answer the question. Is science the only source of knowledge? I'm going to give you 3 reasons to reject it. And that may be all the time we have. So 3 reasons to reject scientism. Number 1, the claim that science is the only source of knowledge eliminates vast tracts of scientific knowledge. For example, we believe that electrons exist, but nobody's ever observed electrons. We posit that electrons exist, but that's just something that is supposed to support the knowledge that we have, but it's not something that's been observed. We believe in the laws of logic, such as the law of excluded middle, that every precisely stated statement is either true or false. but you can never prove that. We believe that the universe is more than 5 minutes old and not just created 4.5 minutes ago with an appearance of age. But you can never prove that that's true. See, we believe in the past, but you couldn't prove that the past is real. It's entirely reasonable to believe that it is, but you couldn't test it in a laboratory. We just require the belief of the past in order to make sense of our experience, and we do so quite reasonably. But it's not something you could prove scientifically. What about the reality of other people's minds? Have you ever thought about that? I know this is a little bit unusual to think about, but how could you possibly prove that you're not the only mind in the universe? You can't. There's no way. It's just a basic belief that allows you to make sense of your experience, but there's no way you could prove it. What about the law of cause and effect? That if I hit my hand real hard on the podium, that it is the hitting of my hand on the podium that causes the pain in my hand. Well, it seems entirely reasonable, and it's correct, but how could you prove that scientifically? There's really no way to prove it. That one thing causes another, it's just that one thing comes after another. You can see that, but causation itself is something you cannot put in a test tube. What even is it? It's something that allows us to make sense of our experience. So if scientism is true, it actually eliminates vast tracts of scientific knowledge. Another reason it's false is the claim that science is the only source of knowledge is itself not scientifically verifiable. There are certain statements that are self-referentially incoherent. In other words, if they're true, they're false. Let me give you a couple examples. What if I said there are no sentences in English longer than 3 words? Think about that statement for a minute. There are no sentences in English that are longer than 3 words. If that's true, it's false. Because it itself is a sentence that's longer than 3 words. Or what if I said, I know no more than 3 English words? If that statement is true, it's false. Because I have just uttered more than 3 English words. So obviously, I know more than 3 English words. And you know, scientism is just like that. Scientism says that science is the only source of knowledge. Can you test that statement in a laboratory? Is it itself scientifically verifiable? It is not. And so if somebody goes around saying the only way you can ever know anything is through science, that's a statement of philosophy. And that itself is not scientifically testable at all. So that's a second reason why scientism is false. Number 3, in our experience of the world, we observe absolute objective truths in the area of morality. For example, it is wrong to torture little children for fun. Who disagrees with that? That is so obviously true that if anybody disagrees with it, you would have to say that that person is crazy. They are just as wrong as somebody who says that 2 + 2 = 5. They are just as wrong as somebody who says the universe doesn't exist. It is just a plain fact of our experience that certain things are really right to do and certain things are really wrong. But can you test any of those things in a laboratory? Can you prove scientifically that torturing little children for fun is wrong? There's no way to prove that scientifically. It is a moral truth that we learn by our experience of the world. We find out as we go through our lives that that is something wrong. Even if we never open the Bible, we found out that it's wrong. Now, if we open the Bible, we can learn it that way. But even if we were to never open the Bible, we would know that that's wrong. Because God has put within us a conscience. Romans 2 discusses that. But see, here are 3 reasons to believe that scientism is false. Let me see if I can make one more point here before we conclude. What is the relationship? Let me give you this. I know we're almost out of time, but let me give you one more thing. What is the relationship between science and the knowledge of God? Science gives you evidence to support premises in arguments that have a theological conclusion. Let me say what I mean. If you make an argument for the existence of God, It is true that you can't test God in a laboratory. You cannot observe God with your five senses. But you can observe plenty of things in the world around you that support premises in an argument that would lead to God. Let me give you an example. Here's an argument for the existence of God from the beginning of the universe. An argument goes like this. It's very simple. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That argument is deceptively simple, but notice that the first two premises are religiously neutral. The conclusion has theological significance. It says that God exists. It has a cause. The universe has a cause. That is pointing to God. So that has theological significance. But the premises, the first two statements, are religiously neutral. In fact, you could find those two statements in many cosmology textbooks, not written by Christians. The first premise says, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, what could be more commonsensical than that? Because from nothing, nothing comes. If you disagree with that, you're threatening all of science. That's the most fundamental principle of all of science. If you have nothing, nothing will produce nothing, because it has no properties. Nothing is the absence of everything. So it has no physical properties, no causality, potentialities whatsoever. Everything that begins to exist has to be caused by something else. See, you don't have to believe in God to believe that. That's just common sense. Premise number 2 says, the universe began to exist. Atheists believe that. In fact, that is the present opinion of cosmology, any university you go to, that the universe began to exist. The second law of thermodynamics teaches that the universe began to exist. All kinds of philosophical arguments show that the universe began to exist. Christian and atheist alike, whether you believe in scientism or not, you believe the universe began to exist. Well, if you believe the first two premises, you must believe the conclusion. It follows without exception. It follows absolutely from the premises. If you believe them, you must believe the conclusion. Just like if you believe all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. What would you think of somebody who said, well, I believe all men are mortal, and I believe Socrates is a man, but I don't believe Socrates is mortal? You would say that person is confused. That person may have mental issues. But you wouldn't say that that person is correct. Well, similarly with this argument, science gives you the first premise, science gives you the second premise, and therefore science indirectly gives you the conclusion that God exists, even though the observation of God directly by our five senses is impossible. What has science done? It has provided evidence to support those first two premises. Notice, and I'm going to show you the other way in which science relates to the knowledge of God. Science provides a context in which the Bible can show itself to be from God. The last thing I want to do is just give you an argument. Now, I know this is a lot of words on the screen, but this is an argument for the inspiration of the Bible. So if we can prove that God exists based on premises that are supported by science, and we can prove that the Bible is inspired based on a context that science has provided for us, then we've gone a long way toward resolving any doubt that we have about God and the Bible based on science. So let's read this argument together. It says, the supernatural origin of a book, any book in the Bible, Genesis, Revelation, Matthew, could be established in two ways. Either by the presence of material in the book that could not be the result of mere human origin. I think I put of material in there twice, I'm sorry. Or number 2, attestation of the work's supernatural origin by a person who speaks with divine authority, like Jesus or Paul. At least some of the books in the Bible contain material that could not be the result of mere human origin. I think all of them do, but for the sake of making an argument to a skeptic, we'll just say at least some of them. And all the books in the Bible are attested to have supernatural origin by a person, that is Jesus, who speaks with divine authority. Therefore, the Bible has a supernatural origin. Now, what does science have to do with that? Well, science will give us the knowledge that, naturally speaking, people do not rise from the dead. But Jesus rose from the dead. Therefore, that gives us access to knowledge of a person who has divine authority and who can speak to the supernatural origin of a text. So if Jesus, as somebody who is raised from the dead, looks back to the book of Genesis and says that's from God, as Jesus in passages like Luke 24 looks back at the entire Old Testament and treats it with authority. So Jesus can look back as a person with divine authority at the entire Old Testament and give it God's stamp of approval and say this is from God. Another way science relates to this argument is, notice that number one, the presence of material that could not be the result of mere human origin. Well, that would include scientific foreknowledge. If Moses, writing about 1400 years before Christ, could say things about germ theory that would not be discovered by modern science until the 19th century, well, that is the presence of material in that book that could not be the result of human origin. So science provides a context in which both 1 and 2 can be fulfilled. The presence of material in that book that could not be the result of mere human origin, like scientific foreknowledge, and the divine authority of a person who could look back on those books that have been written and say they are from God. So science provides a context that can prove the inspiration of the Bible. One more way in which science provides that context is with divine prophecy. Because if a person can look forward hundreds of years into the future and predict in minute detail what's going to happen, even in another country, like Daniel does, look forward to the establishment of the kingdom of Christ in Daniel 2. Well, naturally speaking, based on the way science has observed things to occur normally, nobody can do that. If it's in there, if that material is in the Old Testament, then that proves that that book has a supernatural origin. So, stepping back from this, far from calling into question our Christian faith, science actually provides evidence that gives us premises in arguments that lead to the existence of God and the inspiration of the Bible. So a Christian has nothing to fear from science. A Christian rather says science is valuable, science is important, and actually supports the enterprise of proving Christianity to be true. It may be that you've been struggling with doubt yourself about the existence of God or the inspiration of the Bible or something the Bible says. The study of science ought to always reassure us that God exists and that the Bible is His Word and that Jesus is His Son. We haven't taken the time to prove all that. We've just said there is a good relationship between true science and what the Bible says. That only leads us to ask ourselves, are we doing what the Bible says? Are we in a right relationship with God? Or do we need to make a change there? Have you repented of your sins? Are you ready to confess that Jesus is the Lord? Have you been immersed into water to have your sins forgiven? Or is there someone here who would like to be restored to faithfulness, knowing that you've gone away from God and you're no longer a faithful child of His and you want to come back to Him? We stand ready to assist you. Come now, as together we stand and while we sing.